Was anyone else getting geared up for autumn and like Halloween and the change in season in general, and then this heat wave just came back again?
I just want to go to a pumpkin patch and then sit under a blanket.
But instead, it's 22 degrees at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'm about to cover myself in makeup and face paint. That was a really whiny intro. I'm very sorry. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and today we are back with another episode of Monsters, Myths and Makeup, which is a little series that I have where we get to delve into the weird and wonderful world of monsters and myths, whilst I attempt to bring the stories to life through a makeup look inspired by the creatures behind the legends. If you have any interest in mythology and or makeup, I would recommend hitting subscribe, because that basically covers a lot of what I do. If you're already subscribed, thank you. Please feel free to hit like if you enjoy the video. Now, I've mentioned this for the last couple of weeks, but I need to apologise for it again. There is so much construction work going on in the house next door to ours, and they're drilling and hammering and sawing and doing God knows what. I will try my absolute best to sort of keep it out of the recording or like edit it out if I can afterwards, but if some of the sound creeps in, I'm really, really sorry. There's literally nothing I can do about it. Also, I think they may be setting up some kind of weird bandstand scenario outside. I saw a load of people with speakers earlier, and I keep hearing what sounds like someone testing a mic. So yeah, if that starts happening, I might have to switch to voiceover like I did last week. I want to try and keep my videos more like talky, but it's just so many sounds. I am overwhelmed. But just to give a bit of a heads up on the situation we are currently in, if I do have to like change things around, but I will try my best. Now, last episode we looked into the evolution of the golem all the way from myth to Minecraft. So this week we're going to be looking at something that's still fairly relevant in like modern day terms, but it definitely falls into more of the obscure folklore kind of category. And, very excitingly, we will be diving into Australian mythology for the first time, or more specifically into some of the Aboriginal mythology from like southeastern Australia. Big thank you to my Patreons for helping me decide this week's topic. If you want to get involved in more sort of behind the scenes stuff, have a little bit of input into the content you want to see, I'll leave a link to the Patreon in the description down below. Now, before we get too sucked into the mystery of this creature, let me go get myself prepped and ready to go. So in the meantime, grab a Red Bull, grab a Monster, grab a seat, and let's go. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will leave links to all the products that I use in the description box down below. As always as well, I will apologise in advance for any and all errors in pronunciation of words, names, places. A lot of my research is into quite ancient history, and it goes kind of all over the world. Some of the words that I come across are really hard to say. I do always try my best, but please feel free to correct me in the comments if I do get any of them wrong. So Australia is known for being home to a huge range of animals and creatures, with the joke being that 99% of them want to kill you. And originally, this particular creature that we're going to be looking into fell within that 99%. I've unintentionally matched this base colour to the light behind me. So coming in second to Australia's quite infamous range of huge spiders, Australia is also very commonly associated with various creatures that live in the sea or in the water, given that Australia is, an island. And again, this particular creature falls under the category of something that lives within water. I don't know how much my camera is picking up of the bells that are happening outside, but you know how I mentioned there was like a bandstand thing being set up? I'm now coming to realise it's something to do with the church across the road. So as much as I really wanted to be able to sit and talk through this mythology with you, I unfortunately again may have to switch to voiceover. So I'm going to hand the reins over to editor Hazel to take it from here. Hello again, future/Hazel stepping in to take over with the story, because I picked possibly the worst day to try and film this episode, between the construction work and then the bandstand and the church bells that basically went on all day. I had no chance of being able to film it and it not be terrible. So, just like last week, I will be taking over the story from here, not that we got particularly far into it. So sit back and we'll basically start again. We covered the fact that Australia, as an island, is known for having a large variety of animals, most of which are significantly dangerous. And being an island, a lot of these animals do live within the sea, among the corals, lakes, riverbeds, you name it. And this creature is more specifically associated with swamps, creeks, riverbeds, waterholes, and something known as billabongs, which, side note, because I had to look it up, a billabong is a branch of a river that forms a small backwater or stagnant pool. So it is a permanent water feature or body of water, and it's sometimes referred to as like a kind of lake. So that's kind of have like a small lake in mind. Now, have you ever been near a still billabong in Australia at night? No? Me neither. But let me paint you a picture. Crickets chirping, frogs croaking, lots of other general ambient nature noises. But you then hear it, a deep, booming call that echoes across the water. An incredibly eerie sound that has fueled stories for centuries about a creature called the Bunyip. One of Australia's most enduring legends, but what exactly is it? Where does the word come from? And why did 19th century newspapers go absolutely crazy about Bunyip skulls? And maybe even more bizarrely, how did this mysterious water creature end up being associated with Australian politics? So, to begin with, what exactly is a bunyip? In the simplest sense, the bunyip is a creature said to live in waterholes, rivers, swamps, etc., all across Australia, but particularly in the southeast. But here's the thing, it's not one single story, or even one single creature for that matter. Different Aboriginal nations have different names and different beings connected to water, and over time, European settlers in particular kind of mashed them all together under this one word, bunyip. Now, traditionally, these stories that you hear about these creatures are about more than just monsters. A lot of them are linked very closely to cultural traditions and laws, respect for the land and the country, and essentially just as a warning for the dangers of water. So the word bunyip itself, where did that come from? It can actually be traced back to the Wemba Wemba or Waigea languages of the Aboriginal people in what is now northwest Victoria. Side note, sincere apologies if I pronounced that wrong, please let me know how it's meant to be pronounced. Today, the word is usually translated to mean devil or evil spirit. However, there is a debate about whether this modern translation is actually accurate to the role of the creature in Aboriginal mythology before the arrival of the early English settlers. Because these settlers began using this term, and before long, it became a kind of catch-all name for any strange water creature, which obviously back in the sort of 1800s or even earlier, there was a lot of strange water creatures that nowadays we know what they are. Back then, not so much. Some have suggested that there may actually be a linguistic connection between the bunyip and a creator deity from Aboriginal mythology known as Bunjil, a celebrated culture hero and ancestral being believed to have created the mountains, rivers, animals, and man. In 1812, the word barnyip was first published in the Sydney Gazette, used to describe a large black animal, like a seal, with a terrible voice. Following on from this, newspapers and sort of the media in general loved it. And from sort of the 1840s onwards, the word bunyip started appearing everywhere. First fun fact of the video, by the 1850s, so not even that long after it had started getting popular, it had already begun being used in slang. In particular, someone within Australian politics coined the term bunyip aristocracy, which essentially became a way of calling someone like a bit of a wannabe, a bit of a phony. But the phrase really stuck and I think does still get used to this day. Now, this black seal-like animal is the first that I've mentioned about the appearance of this creature, because trying to describe this creature is where things get a bit weird and just incredibly varied. Now, as with many localized legends, particularly surrounding any kind of umbrella term that gets used to refer to multiple creatures, it can be incredibly difficult to find an agreed upon description of them. If you were to ask 5 colonial newspapers what a bunyip looked like, you would get 5 different answers. Some descriptions make it sound like a giant seal, smooth fur, big whiskers, flippers. Others more like horse-sized with a dog-like head and a mane, or even an emu's head on a crocodile's body. There are reports of tusks, horns, long claws, or even a creature more akin to a starfish. Along the banks of the Fiery Creek in Victoria, an outline image of a bunyip was carved by Aboriginal people, and it was first recorded by the Australasian newspaper in 1851. According to this report, the bunyip had been speared after killing one of the men, and there were claims that up until the 1850s, the Aboriginal people would revisit the place every year to retrace the outline of this figure, which was allegedly 11 paces long and about 4 paces in breadth. Now, I would love to show you some kind of reference image for this outline, but unfortunately, the outline itself no longer exists, and any of the records about it were long before we were able to take any photos of it, so it is unfortunately completely lost. But based on any first-hand accounts of people who witnessed this creature, the description most commonly fit into one of 2 categories. 60% of the sightings resembling seals or like swimming dogs, while 20% of the sightings are described as long-necked creatures with very small heads. The final 20% of the sightings are basically so ambiguous and mixed and inconsistent that you essentially can't categorize them. The seal dog variety is most often described being between 4 and 6 feet long with a shaggy black or brown coat. And according to a number of reports, these types of bunyips have round heads most closely resembling a bulldog, with prominent ears, no tail, and whiskers like that of a seal or an otter. The long neck variety can apparently range between 5 and 15 feet long, again said to have black or brown fur, large ears, small tusks, with a head either like a horse or an emu, with an elongated maned neck about 3 feet long, and a horse-like tail. Which, when I was doing the research, trying to imagine all of those different components together was really difficult, but something about that description has clicked slightly for me. It almost sounds like a cross between an elephant and a giraffe? Does anyone else put that together, or is that just me? Personally, like the seal dog variety, I can kind of understand as being potentially the most realistic origin or version, whatever you want to call it, i.e. it being linked to a lot of existing animals, or potentially being like an animal that did exist at the time but is now extinct. It's the most realistic sounding animal, if that makes sense. Although again, I imagine if you were to try and describe a giraffe to someone who had never seen a giraffe, okay. Because the long neck variety it is really hard to try and imagine those features all together as like one creature. Now, next to the inconsistency of the physical description, a lot of the behaviours, as described by natives and the Aboriginal mythology, are a lot more consistent. They're said to be amphibious, nocturnal, and very reclusive creatures living in these various different bodies of water. They can swim incredibly well, having either fins or flippers, and would usually feed on crayfish. However, some of the legends have portrayed them as these incredibly dangerous, bloodthirsty creatures that hunt down humans, and in particular, women and children. And then there's the sound. A lot of people mention this booming or roaring call that the creature makes, and the sound is used more often in the cases of the creature being dangerous to humans, as hearing that noise across the waters was essentially a warning signal that the bunyip was nearby. As we've seen numerous times with folklore specific to a certain country or place, in the instance of settlers or colonials arriving, a lot of the narrative around those legends begins to shift, and in a lot of cases these legends take on a much more sensationalized view, especially as they start to be recorded and retold through the eyes of the settlers. And this case is no different, because beginning in sort of the mid-1800s, colonial Australia was hit with what some people refer to as Bunyip fever. It was absolutely everywhere. Media and newspapers just couldn't seem to get enough of it. In 1845, the Geelong Advertiser ran a story titled "Wonderful Discovery of a New Animal," claiming that a strange bone had been found near Geelong. Locals said it belonged to a bunyip and referenced a native woman that had been killed by the creature, as well as a man that had several deep wounds on his chest made by the claws of the animal. The article went essentially whatever the Victorian version of viral was. It was reprinted everywhere, and it was actually the first use of the word bunyip in a written publication. Then, less than a year later, in January of 1846, came one of the most infamous stories, which was the bunyip skull. A settler had found a peculiar-looking skull along the Murrumbidgee River in New South Wales, and the initial report suggested that it was the skull of something unknown to science at the time. The settler who had found it claimed that all of the natives said it belonged to a bunyip, and it actually ended up on display in the Australian Museum in Sydney, with people lining up to see it. The museum display only lasted for 2 days, but the papers described it in dramatic detail: mane, tusks, fearsome jaws, and claimed that many visitors had actually begun speaking out about their own bunyip sightings. Now, spoiler, because by July of 1847, several scientists had identified that it was in fact a deformed fetal skull of either a calf or a horse. But this evidence didn't stop the bunyip from becoming a full-blown colonial media craze. One of the other earlier accounts comes from an escaped convict called William Buckley in his 1852 biography, documenting the 30 years that he spent living with the Aboriginal people of the Wathaurong Nation. He refers to a very extraordinary amphibious animal which the natives called bunyip, and his account suggests that he actually saw this creature on several occasions. But he noted that he could only ever see the back of the animal, which appeared to be covered in feathers of a kind of dusky grey colour, and that it was about the size of a full-grown calf. Despite trying, he claimed he could never learn from the locals whether they had seen the head or the tail, but he did cite an example he heard of an Aboriginal woman who had been killed by one, and he in fact emphasised that the bunyip was believed by the locals to have some element of supernatural power to it. Now, something that is particularly important about this legend is that long before Europeans showed up, Aboriginal nations did have many stories about powerful water beings. But these stories weren't folk tales that were told around campfires for entertainment. They were part of the teachings and the lore of the land. They often warned people to stay away from deep water holes and respect sacred sites, with some of these water beings punishing those who broke cultural rules. So when settlers heard these stories and then began recording them, they tended to embellish them and, in some cases, even incorporate elements of European folklore that they'd brought with them, the result being the bunyip that we now read about in those newspapers. It's been argued that before the settlers' retelling of the stories, the creature was a man-eating monster that lived in the waters and prowled the land at night, hunting for women and children. But over time, as the settlers retold the story and began to blend together a lot of different folklore of the area, because remember, the term bunyip was used as a bit of a catch-all name for a very large number of creatures, it became less frightening, and the meaning began to change as well. By the late 1800s, the word became used as an insult, as a way to call someone an imposter, and the creature itself evolved to become a plant eater, not a man eater, before eventually evolving into more of a friendly creature that is often featured in a lot of children's books. So given that the bunyip is technically classed as a form of cryptid, what exactly were people actually hearing or seeing in those instances? And for this, there are 3 main theories that pop up to try and explain it. The first and generally most accepted theory is basically just that they're actually seals. So Charles Fenner, a geographer in the 1930s, suggested that it may have been wandering elephant seals or even leopard seals, as there are records of these types of seals travelling quite far inland along the rivers. And again, in those instances of settlers who had perhaps never seen one before, or even the locals before they knew what it was, seeing these creatures they wouldn't have known. And side note, if I remember correctly, elephant and leopard seals are, one, absolutely huge, two, they do have like a really deep grumbling kind of raw noise to them, and three, if my memory serves me correctly, they are vicious. So it kind of doesn't surprise me that the origin for some of the mythology around this creature could quite probably be traced back to those animals in particular. The second theory is related more so to the noise that people associate with this creature, and it actually relates to a particular bird known as the bittern, which lives in the wetlands and makes an insanely deep, booming call. And again, I imagine if you were to hear that in the middle of the night with no real context of what it was, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me that people jumped to it being this kind of dangerous monster. Similar in a way to some of the animals that have potentially been linked to the origins for like the banshee screams in Ireland. I think it was a particular type of owl or eagle owl that people often associated it with. The third theory, which again is actually quite a believable one, is based basically on fossils or megafauna bones. So there are some writers who think people came across fossils of extinct creatures like the Diprotodon and essentially kind of carved these stories about what the creatures were actually like and what they did. Because again, the argument has been made with a lot of dinosaurs that are very well known, i.e. a T-Rex, because we only ever have the skeletons to go off. If you were to look at the skeleton of, say, a platypus, or to be fair, pretty much any animal, if you look at their skeleton compared to what they actually look like, it is so unbelievably different. So it's really hard to build a genuine image of a creature based purely on its skeletal form. So again, it wouldn't surprise me if quite a lot of mythology and folklore especially about dangerous, scary mythological creatures could be traced back to basically finding fossils for animals that are no longer around. Now, while most recorded sightings of the bunyip were concentrated in the 1800s, thanks to the settlers and the newspapers, the bunyip didn't vanish after the 1800s. Today, it still pops up in a huge number of places. Within Australia itself, there are place names linked with it. So there is the Bunyip River in Victoria, and there is actually even a town called Bunyip. It's very prevalent in pop culture in Australia, kids' book, horror stories, TV shows, you name it. And again, the bunyip aristocracy phrase, it's stuck around and people still use it when mocking sort of wannabe elites. Some regions even began using the bunyip as a sort of local mascot, and there are statues and signs and even a bunyip in Murray Bridge that pops up from a pond on demand. Which again, depending on how much of the mythology they've taken on, I guess that would technically class some of those towns as like cryptid towns, but I saw a bit of discourse between people as to whether or not the bunyip falls into the category of cryptid or not. I don't know if I think it counts as a cryptid because it's based more in the mythology of the Aboriginal people rather than cryptids. For me feel a bit more like urban legends almost, a bit like Mothman, essentially. The variation of bunyip that got made popular in the 1800s by all of the settlers, I think that kind of side of it is more cryptid territory, whereas the actual origins and the original mythology, I think, is completely separate. I'd be really interested to know what you guys think about that, because it's quite an interesting debate, because it's a bit of a blurred line because of how much it evolved as it got retold. Because that is one of the cooler parts that I found about this myth, is that it sparks quite an interesting conversation about sort of like cultural heritage and essentially like how colonial storytelling ended up shaping some of Australia's identity and particularly their folklore and mythology. And it's a really interesting case study in how myths can evolve when different cultures meet. I see it quite a lot within the research that I've done, particularly things like Celtic mythology or pagan beliefs, that kind of thing. There is quite a big shift when it then gets sort of adapted into things like Christianity and other religions or cultures. So it's fascinating to look at it on like the other side of the world and how much it's changed that way around too. Now, because this creature has such a varied description, behaviour pattern, etc., it's quite hard to find any other mythology that can be like directly compared to it, because it's more of an amalgamation of different creatures. But it did lead me into a rabbit hole of other creatures from Australian mythology, and especially Aboriginal mythology. For example, one of my favourites has to be the drop bear, which debatable about whether it's technically classed as a myth or a belief or anything like that. But it was a hoax in contemporary Asian folklore about a predatory carnivorous version of a koala bear that was essentially used as a bit of an in-joke in Australia to try and scare tourists. I vaguely remember hearing about it before, but I couldn't remember, and then I read up about it. It's hilarious, because like the entirety of Australia just went in on this idea, just kind of collectively agreed to keep the joke going. And I've never seen anything like that in my research before, of like a community, let alone a country, agreeing to this, kind of being on board with this sort of hoax idea as a bit of a jab against like tourism and things like that. It was quite there's something very, very entertaining about it, I can't lie. On a slightly more serious note, there's something known as the Min Min light, which is a light phenomenon often reported in the outback, and it's believed to have influenced a lot of the original Australian Aboriginal mythology. Again, it draws a lot of comparisons in my mind to like the legend of the Will-O-Wisp, where a lot of people think it can be explained by light reflections or like gases in the air. I can't remember the specific scientific reasoning behind it, but it's these sort of strange light apparitions that, again, way back when they would have had no idea what it was, had a huge influence on like the stories that people told and what people believed they were. There's also something known as the Nargun, which is a fierce, half-human, half-stone creature who would drag travellers into its den, or the legendary Yaramayahu, I think is how it's said, which was a vampiric monster that resembled a little red frog-like man with a really big head, a really big mouth, no teeth, and suckers on his hands and feet. Which... something viscerally uncomfortable about that description for me. And again, on that lovely note, I will pass you back over to Past Hazel, who should be about finished by now. Thank you again to editor Hazel for stepping in to cover the actual myth and story this week. The church bells and the noises continued for so long. But it did mean that I was able to take my time a little bit more with this look, and I will be honest, whilst it probably doesn't make much sense at the moment with regards to the story, as a look, I'm really happy with how this turned out. I think this may be one of my favourite looks that I've done for a while. As for the relevance to the actual story, now, obviously, as you understand at this point, trying to sort of depict the Bunyip, like, properly, it's almost impossible to do because there's no set upon agreed description of it. No one knows what it looks like. There's all these different sightings and variations on it, and some of they're so different as well, from being like a seal, otter kind of swimming dog creature to having like the head of almost like a bird or a horse or something in between. It's a really, really strange creature. So rather than try and like turn myself into a seal, because I'll be honest, that just wasn't very inspiring to me and it felt a bit too on the nose. The word that I got hooked on when I first started doing this research was the word amphibious, and in correlation to sort of Australia and the water sources in particular that were included in this, my brain just kept going to frogs. Because Australia does have a number of different frog and sort of toad variants, including several that are poisonous and will kill you. I wanted to give a bit more of a nod to it in that sort of link, like a kind of amphibious creature, but like a bit weird, but then obviously I wanted to make it a bit glam with the lashes and everything. Because I'm not gonna lie, I do feel quite cute. But so I know the link is tenuous at best to this story, but I hope you can kind of understand why. And I hope you're not judging me too harshly for it. Because like I said, I'm really happy with how this look turned out. But rambling aside, What do we think? This was such an odd one to try and research because there is no set definition or agreed upon appearance or behavior. The meaning of the word and the creature has changed over time with the influence of like the settlers. It's evolved so much, so it's been a really, really fascinating topic to look into from like a kind of like cultural heritage and like shift in culture perspective, if that makes sense. Of all the research that I've done, I've never really looked into sort of Australian stuff before, so again, that's kind of like opened up a new door for me of just some really, really interesting tales and stories. If any of you know anything else about this creature or you have any experience with these kind of tales, please, 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 please let me know. Leave a comment down below. I love hearing your guys' experiences with them. Especially people from like other countries can put their input into it as to like what they've heard growing up, what they've experienced, that kind of thing. I honestly can't make my mind up about what I think the real version or story is with this because it is so inconsistent in its tales, and just the fact that the word got used to kind of encompass a number of different things, it's very much kind of muddied the waters, if you'll excuse the pun. Is it a pun? That would be a pun, wouldn't it? So what do we think? Was it a water spirit? Do you think it was something like a seal that got sort of like misidentified and then combined with the noise of the boom bird? Or is it kind of somewhere in the middle of all of those things, just kind of like a perfect storm of all these different aspects that come together to create this particular story? Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think of the lore. Let me know what you think of the look. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for helping me choose this week's topic. If you want to get involved, link in the description. And a big thank you to all of you guys as well for just supporting me and watching these videos in the first place. But other than that, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I love and appreciate all of you so, so much. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye.